Hey everyone, Carl here with Littleroot Lessons, bringing you a deep dive featuring Zacian this week. Zacian is something we probably haven't covered, more so because of the fact of its sheer popularity, being so popular that we just don't feel the need to cover it. But as we wrap up Series 10 here, we have about a month left of it, it's probably good to take a look at the ever-famous sword Doggo and see what Zacian can do in this more restrictive metagame. But before we get into all that, make sure to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, do all that fun YouTube stuff for us. It helps us out a ton. Zacian is probably one of the most powerful restricted Pokemon we've ever seen when it comes to restricteds. In its crown form, it boasts a base 170 attack stat and a base 148 speed stat. So if you're thinking about it in terms of where it stacks up speed-wise, the only Pokemon that outspeed it are Calyrex Shadow and Regieleki. Those are the only two Pokemon that can naturally outspeed it without items. That being said, it still has very good damage, so you don't have to invest a ton of speed, and its decent bulk means that it can take a lot of hits if you put investment into those stats, into HP, defense, and special defense, and so on. If you pair all of that with Zacian's unique Intrepid Sword ability, where it gets a +1 attack boost when it enters battle, it makes Zacian an all-around offensive threat that your opponent must deal with to win the game. Things that Zacian does well are just like dealing tons of damage with Behemoth Blade. It gets access to close combat, play rough, wild charge, things like that. And there's also more bulkier role-oriented Pokemon like Zacian that Zacian can kind of do with things like Swords Dance or Substitute and so on, stuff like that. Zacian's history in the format has been all positive. There's been no spot where Zacian's seen less than probably high average play. Currently it's at 23%, and I think in Series 8 it got to about 25%. It was about 1 in every 4 restricteds you'd run into was a Zacian in Series 8. And it's currently the way it's starting to look at in Series 10 as the format has developed. No longer are we determined just to have Xerneas mirrors all day and try to beat that. It's more back to the way Series 8 was, where we see Zacian a lot, we see Calyrex Shadow, we see Calyrex Ice. Xerneas is still there in the foreground as our, like, Kyogre of sorts for this format. And speaking of Kyogre, Kyogre's there too, just not in the same numbers that Zacian is showing up in. Common partners for Zacian are actually fairly straightforward to find. Zacian's sheer amount of play would lead you to believe that there is a ton of partners being played with it, a ton of testing and things like that, but it's actually been boiled down to a fairly solid team core that we see, that being of Zacian plus the Fire, Water, Grass core of Rillaboom, Rapid Strike Urshifu, Incineroar, and like Regieleki. Landorus is usually the 6th Pokemon paired along with these guys, but other pairings are things like Suicune, Amoonguss. We see those every once in a while. Other common pairings are things I've seen Volcarona be a common pairing. I've seen other genies be popular. I think Thundurus is starting to make a tick back up in the format as like this speed control taunting thing instead of being an offensive threat like it was in Dynamax formats. So as the formats have developed, we kind of see that Fire, Water, Grass is really good with Zacian. You want Regieleki for speed control most of the time, and then you kind of want a flying type to go along with it to kind of eat those ground type attacks. And Landorus just plays really well, so a lot of the times we see both Incarnate and Therian as like either double Intimidate or as just sheer force life form. When you look at the metagame breakdown here, you see that Behemoth Blade is the most popular move on Zacian. To the surprise of no one, if you have your Rusted Sword, your Iron Heads become Behemoth Blade, so you get the Crown form. Which Rusted Sword is the most common item on Zacian because it gives you Crown form. You see the pattern here. Behemoth Blade is base 100, it does massive damage to so many Pokemon, steals very good offensive typing when it comes to just dealing damage. I think there's very few resists, and it's super effective to some of the more common types we see in like Fairy and Rock and stuff like that. Protect is the second most common move on Zacian. You need to protect your Zacian. You need to keep it safe, keep damage off of it. Protect's the best way to do that. We're also seeing the rise of Substitute Zacian in Series 10, more so than we saw in 8. We saw it a little bit at the tail end of Series 8, but as Series 10 has developed, Substitute has become more and more common. And this is just good for like trying to play a more bulky, longer game plan. If you can bait them into thinking you have a Protect on this turn and get a free Substitute up, that means your Protect next turn keeps you alive even longer, and so on and so forth. When it comes to coverage moves, though, we see things like Play Rough, Sacred Sword, Close Combat, Sword, and Wild Charge. Those tend to be the common coverage moves. Sacred Sword is probably the one that players play with the most, mainly because it doesn't care about defense boosts, so you get to blow up things like a +3 stack attack fairly easily, instead of having to sit there and try to fight through it with a Behemoth Blade or a Close Combat. Play Rough is also fairly common, more common than I thought it would be just initially because of overall damage output. You kind of just want steal and you kind of want fighting, and then you want Protect and Substitute or Protect and Sword Stance and stuff like that. So Play Rough is kind of usually pushed out in my opinion, but according to this, Play Rough is same play rate as Sacred Sword. So if you're playing Dragon types, beware of Play Rough. Do not think that your Dragon types are safe in front of Zacian. Close Combat here is a very close second when it comes to fighting. It's usually the other option over Sacred Sword, mainly because it just deals more damage. I'm not sure if there's a calc to where neutral 252 attack Zacian can take out Incineroar with Close Combat, but there might be. That might be why we see it at such a high usage. I would have to double check on that. And then we see things like Sword Stance here as a secondary support utility move. Sword Stance Protect is very common alongside Sword Stance Substitute. Those are just things to think about when you're looking to play with your Zacian. And as I mentioned, Rested Sword, 100% of the time, there's no reason to play anything else. When you're looking to build with Zacian, even though it's very offensive oriented with its very high attack stat, very high speed stat, and looking to deal a bunch of damage, Zacian actually plays more like a mid-range, slower kind of Pokemon. A lot of the times you want to invest in bulk so you can win the mirror or survive that earth power or survive that high horsepower. So bulkier Pokemon tend to make better partners instead of the hyper-offensive threats that we were used to seeing in Series 8. Gone the way of the wind is like Whimsicott or Indeedee, these support Pokemon to redirect hits or to make sure you outspeed, and more so are we seeing things like Rillaboom, Bulky Water Urshifu, Incineroar, Bulky Landorus, and stuff like that. Since Zacian has a really high attack stat already, like I mentioned, you don't have to invest in all of that attack to actually deal significant damage to your opponent. You're going to be at +1 most of the time, especially if it's just like you've called the right switches, the Intimidator's already in, you get to switch your Zacian and you're going to be at +1. Things like that. So you don't need to invest a ton into your attack stat to actually deal damage, and you can look at putting it into HP, speed, and the defenses where it's going to matter more when it comes to opposing Zacians and things like that. When you're looking at movesets here, we have two very distinct movesets here. The first one is probably the more common one you'll see on ladder. A lot of HP, decent attack investment, decent speed investment. This gets to 186. I don't remember the exact benchmark for that, but if I remember correctly, it's something to do with Mind Shao, I think. I can't quite remember. Sacred Sword, Behemoth Blade, Protect, Substitute, pretty standard. All this stuff. I think we have enough attack to where we can blow up a Incineroar with Sacred Sword at +1 if we need to, and things like that. But a lot of the Zacian sets are differentiated by the moves and EVs that you have. As we see in the second set here, this is a very offensive, going to pound my head into a wall and blow things up that we would see in Series 8. Jolly Nature for maximum speed, Play Rough, Close Combat, Behemoth Blade, Protect. Looking to deal a ton of damage, don't really care what's in front of us, we're just going to hit you really hard with that Behemoth Blade, hit you really hard with that Close Combat. So it's kind of cool to see that Zacian can still be different things while also still being an offensive threat. there's a big trade-off when you're doing these kinds of things with Zacian. You can play the standard Zacian and be a known quantity, and your opponent can expect the moves that you have, and you can kind of maybe play around with substitutes like the sword stance and things like that, but a lot of the times your opponent's going to be able to read your Zacian and what's going on. The trade-off here for this faster, more offensive Zacian with play rough is you get to catch your opponent off guard. You get to hit that play rough into that dark type and pick it up. You get to hit that play rough into that dragon type and pick it up, and things like that. So it's kind of fun to see that Zacian can play both sides of the same coin, doing different things. When you're looking to beat up an opposing Zacian, Zacian suffers a lot from Intimidate spam. It wants to stay in and it wants to deal damage a lot of the time. It wants to sit behind that substitute. It wants to sit behind all of those damaging moves, but the big thing that causes problems for Zacian is when it can't deal damage, when it gets intimidated cycle, like with things like Incineroar and Landorus Therian. Gyarados is another one that's starting to become much more popular as the format has developed. We'll talk about Gyarados, I believe, on Friday. I think that's what I have planned for that one. But definitely use your Intimidator to great effect against the opposing Zacian. Most teams are spec'd to try and outspeed faster Pokemon than Zacian, honestly. A lot of teams are looking to outspeed Calyrex Shadow, or they're trying to outspeed Regieleki. So definitely look at outspeeding Zacian if you can. Tailwind Landorus is something that I'm seeing pop up quite a bit. It's just like, I'm going to blow you up with Earth Power and stuff like that. Being weak to fire and ground means that you almost always have some kind of super effective hit into Zacian. So Zacian can definitely struggle if caught out of position, if you time his switch correctly or get him into a unadvantageous position. Oh my goodness, y'all, I can't talk today. So definitely look for positions to where you can catch that Zacian, get some chip on it, get a little bit of damage, because every time you hit that Zacian, there is a chance that you're reducing a substitute chance. So definitely putting damage on Zacian is a good thing. To wrap up with Zacian, Zacian looks like the almost perfect Pokemon. High attack, high speed, good defenses, does a lot of cool things for hyper-offensive teams like we saw in Series 8. But with its typing and its decent bulk, you can actually afford to play a slower, grindy game with Zacian. Looking to invest into HP, invest into some defenses, make sure you live those hits, and still have enough attack investment to take out opposing Zacians, Incineroars, and things like that. And to think about all that, Intrepid Sword makes Zacian a force to be reckoned with, but having a proper plan means that you can easily beat up the powerful Sword Doggo. Like I mentioned, Tailwind Landorus is becoming a thing that you can do. I know Sableye is starting to see some tick up in play, so that can cause issues for Zacian as well, being quashed and then getting blown up, and things like that. So definitely having a plan before you build your team or while you're building your teams to beat up a Zacian is always a good thing to have. With that being said, I want to thank you all for hanging out and listening to me ramble about Zacian this week. Remember to check us out on Twitter. All of our handles are there on screen. Check out the Discord link in the description down below. And remember to subscribe, YouTube stuff, comment, ring the bell, all that fun stuff. It helps us out a ton and it's free to do. All we can ask is that you just help us out a little bit. And with that being said, hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening if you're out in the world, and we will see you all on Friday with Gyarados. Bye, guys.